Anthony and Camille had built a life together, a life that, from the outside, appeared perfect. Their home was warm, their daily routines predictable, and their love seemed steady, if a bit mundane. They'd been married for over a decade, their bond solidified by years of shared memories and comfort. The mornings were spent sipping coffee at the kitchen table, the evenings in front of the TV, or quietly reading side by side. Friends and family often remarked on how well they complemented each other, but beneath the surface, something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that they fought or struggled with any overt issues. There were no obvious cracks. Yet, an invisible distance had crept into their relationship, an unspoken void that neither could quite define. Anthony loved Camille, but there were moments, especially in the quiet spaces between their conversations, where he felt an unsettling sense of disconnect. Camille, on her part, didn't seem unhappy at first glance, but the small signs were there. Her silence at times, her distracted smiles, her gaze lingering elsewhere. They had settled into a pattern, one that lacked the spark of passion they once had, and yet neither was fully aware of how far they had drifted from each other. Their marriage, though not broken, had become routine, and in that routine, the distance between them quietly grew. One evening, as Anthony arrived home from work, he found Camille sitting at the dining table, her posture unusually tense. Her expression was unreadable, and she didn't even look up when he entered the room. Something was off, and the air felt heavier than usual. "We need to talk," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Anthony's heart sank. The words alone caused his pulse to quicken. What could it be? What had happened? Camille's tone was distant, almost detached, and the anxiety built up in Anthony's chest, a knot he couldn't shake. He took a seat, trying to hide his nervousness, but his mind raced. Was she unhappy? Was something wrong with their marriage? "What's going on?" he asked, though his voice trembled slightly. Camille stared at the table for a moment before lifting her eyes to meet his, her gaze empty. "I filed for divorce," she said, as if she were discussing an everyday task. Anthony's breath caught in his throat. Divorce? The word didn't register. His mind spun with disbelief, his thoughts a blur. What? Why? "Camille, I don't," he stammered, trying to grasp the reality of what she was saying. Camille sighed, her gaze drifting away again. I feel so lonely, Anthony. I can't keep doing this." Her words cut through him, and the shock settled in as his confusion grew. How could this be happening? They'd never been perfect, but he didn't see this coming. His mind scrambled to defend himself, but nothing felt right. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, lost. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling silence. Camille's decision hung between them like a heavy fog, thickening with each passing hour. Anthony couldn't understand why she'd felt so lonely, why she hadn't talked to him about it earlier. They still shared the same house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Camille went about her daily routine as if nothing had changed, but the weight of her indifference pressed down on Anthony. He found himself constantly searching for some sign, any glimmer of hope that things could be fixed. But Camille had become a stranger in their home, her words few, her expressions distant. Every attempt Anthony made to talk, to reason with her, was met with coldness. The house had turned into a place of quiet desperation, where Anthony ate his meals alone at the table and slept in a bed that felt too big for one person. The love they once had seemed like a memory from a different life. Anthony tried to rekindle something, anything, but Camille's lack of response only deepened the divide between them. Her absence was not just physical, it was emotional, a growing chasm that no words could bridge. The life they had once shared now felt like a distant dream, and he was left wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. As the days went by, Camille's behavior became increasingly mysterious. She'd leave the house without saying where she was going, her responses vague whenever Anthony inquired. She would return late, sometimes not even offering a simple explanation for her absences. Anthony began to feel an unsettling sense of unease, as if something was slipping through his fingers, something he couldn't quite grasp. He'd catch her on the phone occasionally, her voice soft and playful in a way he hadn't heard in years. Once he overheard her laughing. A sound he hadn't heard in so long. Not from her. Not like that. The laughter felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. Camille's tone was warm, intimate, and Anthony's heart sank with a sudden wave of jealousy. She'd never sounded that way with him in months. The more he thought about it, the more his suspicions grew. The late nights, the unexplained disappearances, the secrecy, something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was seeing someone else. His mind raced with the possibility, each small detail adding weight to his growing concerns. Camille had always been open about her past, and there was one name that lingered in the back of Anthony's mind: Chris, an old friend from Camille's past, someone she'd often mentioned with a smile. But it couldn't be. Could it? Anthony couldn't help but wonder if Camille was falling for someone else, and if that was the reason she had grown so distant. The thought gnawed at him, a gnawing suspicion he couldn't ignore. The truth finally came to light in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, while out with a friend, Anthony was shocked to learn that Camille had been meeting someone regularly. His friend casually mentioned that she'd been seen with a man named Chris, someone Anthony vaguely remembered as an old acquaintance of Camille's. The name hit Anthony like a punch to the gut. Chris, of course. Camille had often talked about him in the past, her old friend from college. They had shared so many memories together, and Anthony had always thought of their relationship as harmless, a mere chapter in Camille's history. But now, hearing Chris's name in this context, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just a friendship. Anthony's thoughts raced as the pieces fell into place. He remembered the way Camille used to speak about Chris, how she would light up whenever his name was mentioned, how nostalgic and wistful her voice would sound. He had always brushed it off, never imagining that something more could develop. But now, the realization hit him hard. Camille hadn't just been reconnecting with an old friend, she had been seeking something more. She had been seeking him. Betrayal washed over Anthony in waves. He felt as if the ground beneath him had cracked open, and the weight of the truth sank into his bones. His worst fear had been confirmed. Camille was seeing someone else, and that someone was Chris. After the divorce, Camille quickly moved in with Chris, eager to embrace the new life she had imagined. The excitement of starting fresh was intoxicating. Chris was everything Anthony hadn't been in recent months: spontaneous, full of energy, and constantly showering her with attention. They traveled together, enjoying weekends away, dinners at new restaurants, and late-night talks that made Camille feel truly seen and desired. For a while it was exactly what she had hoped for: romance, freedom, and a sense of adventure. The weight of the old life with Anthony, full of routine and quiet discontent, faded into the background. Camille reveled in the newness of it all, savoring the attention Chris gave her, feeling wanted in a way she hadn't in years. But as time passed, a hollow feeling began to creep in, though Camille couldn't yet place it. Anthony in the back of her mind seemed like a distant memory, a chapter she'd closed. She told herself she had made the right choice. This was what she needed, what she deserved. But as the days turned into months, she began to wonder if the excitement of her new life was truly as fulfilling as she'd imagined. Meanwhile, Anthony, though devastated, tried to move on, still uncertain of how everything had unraveled so quickly. His heart ached, but he focused on the future, however painful it was. Months into her new life with Chris, Camille started to notice cracks forming in the picture-perfect world she had created. At first, she overlooked small things: Chris forgetting to pay bills or leaving chores undone. But as the weeks passed, it became harder to ignore. She found herself picking up the slack, just as she had with Anthony. The carefree man she had fallen for was slipping away, replaced by someone far more careless and selfish than she had imagined. The late nights, once filled with romantic conversations, turned into frustrating arguments about responsibilities that Chris continually neglected. Camille had once reveled in the excitement of being with someone who seemed so full of life, but now that energy felt draining. Instead of spontaneous adventures, her days were consumed with managing a life that had become more about picking up after Chris than enjoying their time together. The initial thrill of freedom felt more like a burden than a blessing. The romantic connection she had longed for with Anthony now seemed so different from what she had with Chris. The wild, carefree moments she had once cherished now felt hollow and unsatisfying. She had thought she was escaping the routine of her past life, but now the unpredictability of her new situation felt just as exhausting. Doubts began to creep in, and Camille found herself questioning her decision, wondering if she'd truly traded one form of dissatisfaction for another. As the days wore on, Camille couldn't escape the growing weight of regret. She found herself reflecting more and more on her life with Anthony, the stability and calm he had provided. At the time, she had seen it as dull and monotonous, but now, in the chaos of her relationship with Chris, she realized how much she had taken that stability for granted. Anthony had been reliable, responsible, and always there when she needed him. Now, with Chris, Camille felt the absence of those qualities acutely. She was constantly cleaning up after him, dealing with his irresponsibility, and facing the disillusionment of a life that hadn't turned out as she'd expected. The freedom she had so eagerly sought now felt like a weight on her shoulders, and the adventure she had longed for was nowhere to be found. She started to realize that the excitement she thought would fill the void left by her marriage wasn't the answer to her unhappiness. Instead, she missed the comfort of knowing what was coming next, the quiet understanding that had once been the foundation of her life with Anthony. With Chris, there was always a sense of uncertainty, a constant push and pull. The comparison between the two men, the stability of Anthony and the chaos of Chris, became clearer every day. The more she reflected, the more Camille began to feel the sting of her decision. One quiet evening, as Camille sat alone in her apartment, the weight of everything suddenly became too much to bear. Chris was out with friends as usual, leaving her with nothing but the hollow echo of her own thoughts. For the first time, Camille truly confronted the reality of her situation. Chris wasn't going to change. The man she had thought was her escape had only brought her into a different kind of trap, one that was just as confining as the life she had left behind. She had hoped that in leaving Anthony, she'd find something more, something that would finally make her happy. Instead, she felt more lost than ever. Her heart ached as she considered her options. Could she go back to Anthony? Was it even possible to fix what was broken? A deep sadness washed over her as she realized how much she had lost in pursuit of something she thought was missing. The weight of her choices settled into her bones, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a grave mistake. For the first time, Camille questioned if she would ever find the happiness she had been searching for, or if she was doomed to repeat the same mistakes, chasing after fleeting moments of excitement while ignoring the deeper, more meaningful connections that once anchored her. Unable to shake the feeling of loss and regret, Camille decided to reach out to Anthony. She couldn't undo what had been done, but perhaps, in some small way, she could begin to repair the damage. She contacted their daughter, asking if she would pass along a message to Anthony, one that spoke of her regret, her desire for forgiveness, and her hope to fix what was broken between them. She didn't expect everything to be magically fixed, but she clung to the hope that Anthony might still care enough to listen, to consider the possibility of a second chance. Her daughter's response, however, was colder than she had anticipated. She questioned whether Anthony would ever take Camille back, voicing her doubts about the sincerity of Camille's intentions. The words stung, but Camille understood. After all, she had left Anthony, and the pain of that abandonment could never be erased with a simple apology. Still, Camille held on to the sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, Anthony might still have feelings for her, that there was a chance to rebuild what they had lost. But with each passing day, that hope seemed more and more distant. She didn't know if she could ever find her way back to him, but she was desperate to try. Camille's heart raced as she anxiously awaited a response from Anthony. She checked her phone obsessively, hoping for some sign that he was open to reconciliation. But then one day, her daughter called with news that stopped Camille in her tracks. Anthony had moved on. He wasn't waiting for her to come back. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Anthony had found someone else, a woman who had entered his life while Camille was busy with Chris, someone who had healed his broken heart. Camille's mind raced, but the truth settled over her like a cold, harsh reality. Anthony was no longer the man she could lean on. He had rebuilt his life without her, and the thought of him being happy with someone else hit her harder than she had expected. She had wanted him to be there when she was ready to return, but now it was clear. He had moved on, and she had lost him for good. The weight of her choices and their consequences came crashing down on her. She had thrown away something real, something steady, and now it was too late. As the finality of the situation sank in, Camille realized that there was no going back. Anthony had found a new life, a new love, and she was left with the emptiness of what she had destroyed. In the silence of her empty apartment, Camille found herself reflecting on everything she had lost. She thought about the love she had once shared with Anthony, the quiet evenings, the deep understanding, the stability they had built together. She had left it all behind in search of excitement, a spark she thought would reignite her happiness. But now she saw it for what it was. She had traded something real for fleeting feelings, chasing after thrills and freedom that only led her into deeper loneliness. The regret gnawed at her, a constant reminder of how she had tossed away the very thing she once valued. She watched as Anthony moved on with his new partner, finding happiness, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own mistakes. What she had with him was real, grounded in years of shared experience, but she had thrown it all away in pursuit of something she thought was better. As the days passed, Camille felt a deep emptiness, a void that no new relationship or adventure could fill. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Watching Anthony move on, Camille realized that she would never find the happiness she had once had with him. It was too late to go back, and the love she had lost could never be regained. In the quiet of her loneliness, Camille was left with the painful truth that she had ruined the one thing that had truly made her happy.